What if I told you that a veterinarian could walk into a barn in the middle of the night, respond to an emergency, perform a completely routine and often life saving procedure on a horse, and then, less than an hour later, step outside into the real world, only to test positive for alcohol and get a DUI? Not because they drank, not because they made a mistake, but simply because they were doing their job. It sounds almost impossible, like something out of a legal drama or a misunderstood headline. And yet, according to a real, peer reviewed scientific study, this is not only possible, it is measurable, repeatable, and potentially far more common than anyone realizes. Because deep inside the world of equine medicine, far away from competition arenas and polished dressage tests, there exists a very different reality. One where veterinarians are working under pressure, often in urgent situations, making rapid decisions that can mean the difference between life and death for a horse. And where something as simple as improving the clarity of an ultrasound image can unintentionally expose them to something most people would never even think to question. This study, published in Veterinary Sciences, set out to explore a question that at first sounds almost absurd in its simplicity, and yet, once you understand the context, becomes deeply important. Can veterinarians test positive on a breathalyzer purely as a result of performing equine ultrasound examinations? To understand why this question even exists, you have to understand what these procedures actually look like in real life. Because when a horse presents with something like colic, a condition that can escalate dangerously fast, veterinarians rely heavily on abdominal ultrasound to assess what is happening internally. And in order to get a clear image through the horse's skin, hair, and natural barriers, they often need to use large quantities of ethanol, essentially alcohol, as a coupling agent, and not just a small amount applied once, but repeated applications over extended periods of time, sometimes lasting up to an hour, with the veterinarian working in extremely close proximity to the horse's body the entire time. In other words, they are not just using alcohol, they are effectively surrounded by it. So, researchers decided to test this in a controlled way. They brought in 6 veterinarians and had them perform a total of 36 ultrasound examinations, varying both the duration of the procedures, ranging from 10 minutes to a full hour, and the amount of ethanol used, which in some cases reached an astonishing 2.5 liters. And after each examination, the veterinarians were asked to do something very simple. They were tested using a standard breathalyzer, the same type of device that law enforcement relies on in real world situations, and then tested again and again every 5 minutes until their readings returned to zero. And what they found was not subtle, it was not borderline, and it was not easy to dismiss, because veterinarians did test positive for alcohol after performing these procedures. And though not a single drop had been consumed, and in some cases, those positive readings didn't disappear quickly, they lingered for as long as 60 minutes after the procedure had ended. Even more striking was the pattern that emerged. The greater the amount of ethanol used during the examination, the longer the positive breathalyzer readings persisted, meaning that in more intensive or prolonged procedures, exactly the kind often associated with serious medical cases, the likelihood of a detectable result became even higher. And this is where something becomes fascinating and a little unsettling, because most people think of alcohol exposure in only one way, through consumption. But the human body doesn't actually work that simply. Alcohol can be absorbed through inhalation, especially when exposure is prolonged, concentrated, and occurs in close quarters. And during these ultrasound procedures, veterinarians are often positioned right next to the source, breathing in vapors repeatedly over extended periods of time. with very little opportunity for that exposure to dissipate. The study even compares this effect to things like using hand sanitizer or alcohol based mouthwash, but makes it very clear that the level of exposure during equine ultrasound work is significantly higher, and therefore, the physiological impact is far more pronounced. And this is where implications stop being theoretical and start becoming very real. Because breathalyzer tests are not just scientific tools, they are legal instruments. They are used to make decisions, to determine responsibility, to enforce laws. So imagine this: a veterinarian finishes treating a horse, possibly saving its life in the process. They pack up, leave the barn, and begin the drive home. And somewhere along the way, they are stopped and asked to take a breath test. The result comes back positive, not because they did anything wrong, but because of what they were exposed to while doing something right. And suddenly, the situation becomes complicated, not just medically, but legally. For the equine industry, this raises questions that go far beyond this one study. Because if something like this can happen during a routine diagnostic procedure, then it forces us to reconsider how we think about risk, not just for horses, but for the people responsible for their care. It suggests that veterinarians may need to allow time between procedures and driving, be more aware of their own exposure levels, document the conditions under which they worked, and perhaps most importantly, it suggests that systems outside of veterinary medicine, like law enforcement, may need to better understand the unique environments these professionals operate in. Because at its core, this isn't just a story about alcohol or ultrasound machines. It's a story about how complex and interconnected our world really is, where something is as simple as improving an image on a screen can ripple outward into questions of science, law, and professional vulnerability. And it reminds us that even in a field as grounded and practical as horse care, there are still hidden variables, unexpected consequences, and truths that only come to light when someone thinks to ask the right question. Because the veterinarian standing in the barn, focused, exhausted, and doing everything they can to help a horse in need, is not thinking about breathalyzer readings or legal complications, or how the air around them might be quietly altering the chemistry of their own body. They are thinking about the horse, and yet, for up to an hour after they walk away, their body may be telling a completely different story. So, the next time you think about veterinary medicine or the hidden realities behind the care that keeps horses alive and performing, remember that not all risks are visible and not all consequences are intentional. And I'd really like to hear your thoughts on this. Do you think this kind of exposure should be taken into account in legal situations? Do you think veterinary protocols need to change? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more deep dives into the science, ethics, and hidden realities of the horse world, make sure to subscribe because sometimes the most important stories in equine care are the ones no one thinks to tell.